The morning sun rose slow over the quiet frontier, casting soft orange light across the tall grass in the small cabin where Clara lived with her little daughter. Clara had been a widow for almost 2 years, and every day carried the same quiet struggle. She worked the soil, collected water, and tried to keep her fragile girl healthy. Her daughter Miriam had always been small and weak, often coughing at night until Clara stayed awake beside her bed. Life was heavy, but Clara kept moving because she had no other choice that afternoon. Clara took Miriam to the riverbank so the child could breathe fresh air. The river was calm, and the wind carried the scent of damp soil. Clara dipped a cloth into the water to cool Miriam's face. Whispering gentle words to calm her, she didn't expect anyone else to be there. Most settlers avoided the river at this time of day, fearing the possibility of meeting tribes from the plains. But then she saw movement on the far side of the trees. A tall man stepped out from the shadows, a Comanche warrior with long black hair tied back and a worn blanket wrapped around something small. Clara froze and pulled Miriam close, her heart pounding in her ears. The warrior didn't look at her with anger or threat. Instead, he held the bundle tight in his arms, as if protecting something precious. He walked slowly toward the river, eyes lowered. Shoulders heavy with exhaustion, Clara could hear a weak cry coming from the bundle, a newborn, barely strong enough to make a sound. The warrior knelt at the edge of the river and dipped his hand in the water. Touching the baby's lips to cool them, Clara watched every movement. Unsure whether she should run or stay, her instincts told her this man was not here to harm anyone. There was sorrow in the way he moved, and fear in the way he looked at his child. Miriam tugged on Clara's sleeve and whispered, "Mama." "Baby." Her small voice broke Clara's fear for a moment. She looked closely and realized the newborn girl looked painfully thin and hungry. Clara's heart tightened. She knew the signs of a starving infant because she had once feared losing Miriam the same way. The Comanche warrior finally looked up and met Clara's eyes. His gaze was tired but not unkind. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Two worlds meeting at the riverbank with no word spoken. He nodded once, almost an apology. Then he shifted the baby gently and whispered something in his own language. Clara didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling behind them: grief, worry, and desperation. Something inside her softened. She stepped a little closer. Still holding Miriam tightly, "Is your baby hurt?" she asked in a quiet voice. The warrior hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "Not hurt, but hungry, weak, and slipping away." Clara could see it clearly now. The newborn's skin was pale from lack of nourishment, and her tiny fists hardly moved. The warrior tried to speak in broken English. His voice was low and rough. "Mother gone," he said, touching the baby's blanket with gentle fingers. "Child. No milk." Clara felt her breath catch. She had lost a husband. But this man had lost a wife, and now stood alone with a baby who needed more than he could give. For the first time, fear stepped aside and let empathy step in. Clara looked down at Miriam, who was watching the newborn with wide, innocent eyes. Miriam reached out a hand toward the baby. Not afraid, just curious and caring. Clara looked back at the warrior, and something unspoken passed between them. Both were parents trying to keep their children alive in a harsh world. Both were lonely, carrying burdens larger than their strength. The warrior whispered, "Help." Just that one word. But it held a whole world of worry and hope. Clara's hands trembled, unsure if stepping closer meant danger or destiny. But she could not stand there and watch a baby fade away, not when she had the ability to help. Not when she remembered those nights she cried over Miriam. Afraid she might lose her, she took a slow breath and nodded. "Let me see her," she said softly. The warrior stepped forward carefully, holding the baby out with trembling arms. And in that moment, the day their paths crossed became the day everything began to change. The next morning arrived with a gray sky and a heavy stillness, the kind that makes the air feel thick around a person. Clara barely slept through the night, thinking about the Comanche warrior and the tiny newborn who looked close to fading away. Miriam had fallen asleep quickly, but Clara lay awake, turning over what she had seen. She couldn't forget the look in the warrior's eyes, the desperation mixed with something protective and quiet. It was not the look of an enemy, but the look of a father losing his grip on hope. By sunrise, Miriam was tugging at Clara's hand, asking softly, "Baby again." Clara's heart ached. She didn't want her daughter near danger. But something inside her knew the warrior would return. People in pain often circle back to where they last found a little bit of help. So Clara prepared a small cloth bundle with warm water and herbs. Unsure what she would say if he actually appeared when she stepped outside. The land was silent, the wind barely moved, and all she could hear was Miriam's soft breathing as she held her daughter close. Clara walked a few steps toward the river, not expecting anything, but also not ready to leave the place where everything changed yesterday. Then she saw him. The Comanche warrior stood under a tall cottonwood tree. Cradling his newborn in the same worn blanket, his shoulders were tense, and his dark hair hung over his face as if the night had been long and full of sorrow. He lifted his eyes when Clara approached, and instead of fear or mistrust, there was a quiet pleading in them. It was clear he had no other place to go. Clara kept a cautious distance. "How is she?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The warrior looked down at the child and shook his head. "No milk," he said, his voice cracking. "She cry all night." Clara's breath tightened. She knew what hunger could do to a newborn. Her own daughter had been dangerously close to the same fate once. Without Miriam's grandmother's help back then, Miriam might not have made it now. Here she was, facing the same fear in another motherless child. Miriam, small and unaware of the world's danger, reached out again toward the baby. Clara gently held her back. But the warrior noticed the gesture. "Your girl. She'll need someone," he said slowly. Searching for the English words, "parent figure," he added. Pointing softly toward himself, Clara blinked. Startled by the unexpected honesty of his words, he continued, "My baby. She need nursing." He glanced at Clara, then at Miriam, then back to Clara again. "It is bargain," he said, choosing his words carefully. "You help my child live," he paused. "I help your child grow strong." The idea stunned Clara. A Comanche warrior offering to guide and protect her daughter in exchange for her nursing his infant. It was more than unusual. It was something the settlers would call foolish or dangerous, and the tribes might see as dishonor or weakness, yet the warrior spoke with sincerity. Not demand, he was not asking Clara to join him, follow him, or abandon her life. He was offering a partnership built from the oldest human truth. Children needed to survive. Clara's heartbeat thudded in her ears. She looked down at Miriam, who leaned her head against Clara's arm, tired but trusting. Then she looked at the newborn, whose breaths were shallow, whose eyelids barely lifted. Fear and compassion fought inside her chest. "What is your name?" Clara finally asked, needing something real to hold on to. The warrior touched his chest lightly. "Tahoma," he answered. Then he touched the baby. "Her name is Nayeli," he whispered. As if saying it hurt, Clara repeated the names softly, letting them settle in her mind. Miriam looked up and said the names too, stumbling but trying. Her small voice made Tahoma smile for the first time. A faint, tired smile, but a real one. Clara took a slow breath. She knew this decision could change everything. But she also knew that walking away would doom the newborn to a quiet, painful end, and Clara could not carry that on her conscience. She had already buried one person she loved. She would not watch a child die if she could prevent it. So she stepped closer. "Let me hold her," she said gently. Tahoma immediately offered the baby with careful hands. Relieved beyond words, Nahil's tiny body rested in Clara's arms, light as air and trembling with weakness. Miriam leaned close, fascinated and gentle. Clara felt her heart shift in her chest. As if two worlds had silently shaken hands inside her, she looked up at Tahoma and nodded. "We will help each other," she said quietly. Tahoma bowed his head, gratitude softening the lines of exhaustion on his face. And just like that, a fragile bargain born from hardship tied their fates together, a widow, a warrior, and to children who needed more than the world had given them. What started as a desperate plea became the beginning of an unlikely family. drawn together by survival and something deeper they had yet to understand. Clara carried little Nayeli inside her cabin with careful steps, feeling the small weight trembling in her arms. The newborn's breathing was thin and unsteady, and every weak sound she made tightened the worry in Clara's chest. Miriam followed close behind, holding onto her mother's skirt. Watching everything with wide eyes, Tahoma stood outside the doorway, waiting without crossing the threshold. Unsure if he was welcome inside a settler's home, he looked tense. Listening for any sign of distress from his child, his jaw tight with fear he tried not to show. Clara warmed a cloth with water from the kettle and touched it gently to Nahili's lips. The child barely reacted, too exhausted to cry, too weak to fight for more. Clara felt a heavy ache rise inside her. She had seen infants lose strength like this, and she knew the window to save them was small. Miriam climbed onto the chair beside her mother, whispering, "Mama, help baby." Her small voice pushed Clara's fears aside long enough for her to act. She adjusted herself, held Nayeli close, and began to nurse the newborn. For a moment, nothing happened, and panic surged in Clara's chest. Then Nayeli made a tiny, desperate sound and latched on weakly. Clara let out a shaky breath she didn't know she was holding beside her. Miriam smiled as if witnessing a miracle outside. Tahoma heard the faint sound of his daughter feeding and closed his eyes in relief. He placed a hand over his face, emotionally overwhelmed, but trying to stay composed. He didn't want to intrude, so he stayed by the doorway, waiting like a shadow carved into the frame of the cabin. After several minutes, Clara called softly, "Tahoma, you can come in." Her voice held no fear this time, only tired understanding. He stepped inside slowly. As if entering sacred ground, his eyes went straight to the newborn, who was drinking with fragile but determined effort. His shoulders dropped, and his entire body seemed to release tension all at once. He whispered something in Comanche, a quiet word of gratitude meant only for the child and the spirits above. Clara met his eyes and felt a confusing shiver run through her chest. She wasn't sure if it was fear, relief, or something deeper forming without her permission. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft nursing of the newborn and the crackling of the small fire beside them. But Clara's fears were not gone. They hovered in the corners of her mind like shadows waiting for nightfall. She was alone in a land where danger often hid in plain sight. Trusting a Comanche warrior could put her and Miriam at risk. Both from settlers and from the tribe, her heart argued with her mind. One side begged her to protect her daughter from anything unfamiliar. The other whispered that compassion was the only reason the newborn was still breathing. Miriam reached for Tahoma's hand with innocent confidence. Her little fingers wrapped around his large, calloused one without hesitation. Tahoma stiffened for a second, surprised, then crouched down so he was level with her. Miriam whispered, "Baby okay now?" Her voice soft and hopeful. Tahoma nodded slowly. "Because of your mother," he said. He gently touched Miriam's forehead. A respectful gesture from his culture. Clara watched them, her heart tightening in ways she couldn't explain. She knew her daughter rarely warmed to strangers, but something about Tahoma made Miriam feel safe, as if the child sensed the truth in him before Clara could. When Nayeli finished feeding, Clara held her close, feeling the newborn's breathing steadier than before. Tam's eyes shone with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but strong. "You save her." Clara shook her head. "I just did what any mother would do," she replied. Though she knew many settlers would disagree, fear often made people cruel. Fear made them believe that compassion toward a tribe was betrayal. Clara's own fear whispered those same warnings. But her heart pushed back, louder this time. She carefully placed Nayeli into Tahoma's arms. He held the child with tender strength, as if she was made of glass and starlight. Clara couldn't help but notice the gentleness in him. A warrior with hands trained for battle could still cradle life with devotion after a moment. Clara swallowed her worry and spoke, "Tahoma, if we continue this, others will talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Your people and mine." Tahoma nodded, understanding more than she expected. "They already talk," he said quietly, but my daughter needs you." He paused, his eyes lifting to meet hers. "And your daughter?" "She looks for someone to guide her." Clara felt heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from the truth he spoke. Miriam was lonely, growing up without a father. She needed strength, guidance, and stories from someone who understood the world in ways Clara could not teach. Still, fear clawed at her ribs. "What if this is wrong?" she whispered, mostly to herself. Tahoma shook his head. "Saving a child is never wrong," he said softly. "Helping each other is never wrong." Clara exhaled slowly, as if releasing part of her fear into the room for the first time. She looked at Tahoma not as a warrior or stranger, but as a father fighting for his child's life. A man carrying grief, hope, and responsibility alone. And she realized her own heart was not the only one battling fear. His was too, in that quiet cabin, surrounded by two children who needed them both. Clara made a silent promise to trust the path she had stepped onto, even if the world outside didn't understand it, even if danger waited ahead. Her heart whispered that this fragile bond between them was worth fighting for. And for the first time since her husband's death, Clara didn't feel entirely alone. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the land itself was watching the strange partnership forming between Clara and Tahoma. Every morning Tahoma brought Nayeli to the cabin so Clara could nurse her, and every time the newborn grew a little stronger. Her cries a little louder, her eyes a little brighter. Clara took comfort in seeing the small changes. She had worried that the child might slip away despite her efforts. But Nayeli seemed determined to hold on, as if the love of two households was pulling her back to life. Miriam, who had always been shy around strangers, grew attached to Nayeli quickly. She would sit beside Clara during feedings, stroking the baby's tiny arm or humming soft tunes she learned from her grandmother before the old woman passed. Tahoma watched these moments quietly. Sometimes he sat near the doorway, carving small wooden figures to calm his nerves. Other times he stood outside, scanning the horizon for danger out of habit. But whenever Miriam reached for him or asked him a question, he would turn gentle in an instant, answering with patience and care that surprised Clara more each day. One afternoon, when the sky was clear and the wind carried the warm scent of sagebrush, Clara decided to take both children outside. Nayeli slept in a cloth cradle strapped around Clara's chest. Miriam walked beside her, skipping lightly, excited to show Tahoma the wildflowers blooming near the cabin. Tahoma arrived moments later, as he always did, his steps soft and steady, like someone trying not to disturb the earth beneath him. Miriam ran to him without hesitation, holding a bright yellow flower in her hand. "For baby," she said cheerfully, placing the flower into his palm. For a brief second, Tahoma froze. Moved by the innocent gift, he knelt, brushed Miriam's cheek gently, and tucked the flower behind Nayeli's tiny blanket once Clara handed the newborn to him. The moment created a small warmth between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Clara watched, feeling her heart shift again. She wasn't used to sharing moments of joy with another adult. Her life had been defined by survival, fear, and loneliness since her husband's passing. Now, in the simplest gestures, she saw connection growing not only between the children, but between the four of them as a strange, fragile unit. Tahoma began teaching Miriam small things during his visits. He showed her how to identify tracks left by rabbits and deer. He taught her the sound of different birds and how to listen for danger in the wind. Clara watched from the cabin window sometimes, her heart both fearful and softened. She had never expected her daughter to learn anything from a Comanche warrior. And yet Miriam seemed calmer, braver, and happier around him. She didn't cling to Clara as much. She followed Tahoma with trust and curiosity one morning. Clara stepped outside to see Tahoma crouched beside Miriam, tracing shapes in the dirt. "What are you two working on?" Clara asked, adjusting Nayeli on her hip. "Her name," Tahoma said with a small smile. "I teach her to write it in Comanche." Miriam looked up proudly, pointing at the symbols in the dirt. Clara pressed a hand to her heart, overwhelmed by the sight. Her daughter was learning another language, another way to see the world, something few settler children ever experienced. As the days passed, the bond between the children grew even stronger. Miriam would hum songs while Clara nursed Nayeli, her voice soothing the newborn more than Clara expected. When Nayeli cried, Miriam was often the first to reach her, offering a toy or a soft whisper. Sometimes she even held Nahili's tiny hand until the newborn fell asleep. Clara saw how valuable this connection was. Her daughter was no longer lonely. Nayeli was no longer fading. And Tahoma was no longer a shadow drifting between despair and duty. He became part of their daily rhythm. He brought herbs for Clara, tiny carved toys for Miriam, and warm expressions whenever Nayeli smiled at him. Still, Clara battled a quiet fear inside her. She couldn't ignore the whispers she heard when she traveled to the trading post. People questioned why a Comanche warrior walked near her cabin. Some spoke in low, suspicious tones, suggesting she'd become foolish or bewitched. Clara remained silent, pretending not to hear. But the words stayed with her long after she returned home, despite the whispers. Something inside her insisted that this fragile connection was worth the risk. Watching Tahoma cradle Nayeli and guide Miriam reminded Clara of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that life didn't have to stay cold and lonely. Hope that maybe the world allowed unexpected bonds when hearts were brave enough to protect them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills in a soft golden glow, Clara stood outside with Miriam and Nayeli, asleep in her arms. Tahoma approached from the trees, pausing a moment to take in the sight. Clara felt warmth rise in her chest when their eyes met. Something deep and unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not obligation, just understanding. Two parents from different worlds doing everything they could for two children who needed more love than one world could give. Little by little, without planning it, they were becoming something like a family. Not by blood, not by tradition, but by choice and survival. And neither of them could yet see how deeply this new bond would change their lives. The quiet days didn't last, and Clara felt the first signs of trouble long before anyone knocked on her door. She noticed it in the way the birds fell silent when she walked to the trading post, in the way the settlers glanced at her, then looked away sharply, in the way two older women whispered behind her back as she bought flour. Clara tried to ignore it, but the stares pressed against her like cold hands. People talked, and their words traveled faster than the wind. Rumors spread that a Comanche warrior had been seen near her cabin. Some claimed he visited her daily. Others whispered that she had allowed him inside her home. And the most dangerous rumor of all was the lie that she was mixing with tribes. Clara wanted to defend herself, to tell them the truth, but she also knew that settlers rarely listened to reason when fear was involved. And fear ruled most of their decisions. She returned home with worry, weighing heavier than the supplies she carried. When she saw Miriam running toward her with a bright smile, some of the tension lifted from her heart. Tahoma stood a short distance away. Holding Nayeli in his arms while carving a small wooden comb, Clara stopped to watch them. Realizing how peaceful her home looked compared to the storm rising outside it, but peace could not protect them from whispers. Not forever that evening, Clara sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred a pot of stew. Tahoma stood near the doorway, sensing something was wrong even before Clara spoke. "People are talking," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't look surprised. "They will always talk," he answered. "Fear makes loud voices," Clara sighed. Resting her forehead in her hands, "They think I've been involved with you," she said softly, embarrassed and frustrated. Tahoma's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. "I come only for my daughter," he replied gently. "And for your child who needs strength?" Clara nodded. But the truth didn't stop the fear crawling up her spine. "What if someone tries to hurt you?" she whispered, "or hurt us?" Tahoma stepped closer, his voice steady. "I watch the land," he said. "I know when danger comes." Clara believed him. But danger didn't always arrive with arrows or knives. Sometimes it arrived with angry men and louder lies. A few days later, the trouble finally reached their door. Clara woke to the sound of hooves pounding across the dry earth. 3 settlers rode toward her cabin with stern expressions and rifles strapped to their sides. Fear surged through her. Miriam, still sleepy, clung to her leg as Clara stepped outside. Tahoma, who had been gathering herbs nearby, appeared instantly at the edge of the trees. Silent but alert, one of the men pointed a finger at Clara. "We've heard things," he said sharply. "Dangerous things." Clara held Miriam close, her voice steady but shaking at the edges. "What things?" she asked. "That you've been consorting with a Comanche," he spat. "Letting him walk around your home as if he belongs." Clara's heart pounded painfully. "He's a father," she replied. "His newborn needed help," the man scoffed. "His kind brings nothing but trouble," he growled. "And a good woman shouldn't be mixing her house with their blood at that moment." Tahoma stepped forward, no weapon in his hands, only calm strength in his posture. The settlers stiffened, gripping their rifles. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Leave," Tahoma said steadily. "This is not your place," the settlers sneered. "You don't give orders here," one snapped. "You don't belong here at all, Miriam." Trembling reached for Tahoma. Clara felt her fear melt into anger. How dare they threaten the only man who had helped her daughter feel safe again? She stepped in front of Tahoma before she realized what she was doing. "Go home," she told the settlers firmly. "We are not doing anything wrong," one of the men muttered something under his breath, something filled with prejudice and cruelty. Clara felt her face heat with shame and fury. The standoff ended only when one man noticed Nayeli sleeping safely inside the cradle by the door. His eyes widened with disgust. "You're nursing that child?" He snapped. "A Comanche baby." Clara didn't flinch. "Yes," she said boldly. "Because she deserves to live," the men snarled, shocked by her defiance. But when Tahoma stepped closer, his presence powerful, even without a weapon, they chose to back away. Fear guided their retreat, not understanding. With final threats muttered under their breath, they rode off, leaving dust swirling in their wake. Clara collapsed against the doorway once they were gone. Her breath shaking, Tahoma steadied her with a gentle hand. "You were brave," he said softly. Clara shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I was afraid. So afraid." Tahoma looked at her for a long moment. "But you stood between danger and your children," he said. "That is bravery." Clara glanced at Miriam, who clung to Tahoma's leg for comfort, then at Nayeli, still asleep and unaware of the chaos around them. In that moment, Clara realized something powerful. They were already tied together, not by blood, but by choice, loyalty, and the simple truth that their lives had become woven into one. The world outside their small home was turning hostile, but inside, something true was forming. Something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. The morning after the men rode away, the land felt different. The wind carried a tension Clara could almost taste, and the trees seemed to stand a little too still. Clara moved through her chores with stiff hands, trying to pretend that everything was normal, but Miriam clung to her side more than usual, and Nayeli woke several times during the night, as if sensing the fear around her. Even Tahoma, who was usually calm like the earth itself, kept glancing toward the hills as though expecting danger to crest them at any moment. Clara wished she could soothe everyone, but she could barely soothe herself. She feared the settlers would come again, maybe with more men, maybe with less patience. They might try to force Tahoma away. They might try to take Miriam from her. They might even try to hurt all of them just to make an example. The weight of those possibilities pressed on her chest like a stone. Tahoma came to the cabin earlier than usual that day. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. The look on his face was enough to make Clara's stomach drop. "There are tracks," he said quietly. "Many tracks." "Not from my people." Clara's heart skipped. "Are they coming here?" she asked. "Not yet," Tahoma replied. "But they look for signs." His voice carried no anger, only steady caution. He was used to reading danger long before it reached his doorstep. Clara sat heavily on a chair, holding Nayeli close. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For years I've lived alone and survived. But now everything feels bigger than me." Tahoma stepped closer. Lowering his voice, "You are not alone," he said. "Not now." The weight of his words settled deep in Clara's heart. She didn't know when she had stopped being alone. Maybe the moment she first took Nayeli into her arms. Maybe the moment Miriam reached for Tahoma without fear. Maybe the moment she stood between him and the settlers that afternoon. Clara gathered the courage to ask a question she had been avoiding. "What will you do if those men come back?" Tahoma looked at her without blinking. "Protect my daughter," he said simply. "And protect yours?" Clara swallowed hard. "But that could start a fight," she whispered. "A fight you might not win." Tahoma shook his head. "I do not fight them unless I must," he said. "But I will not run and leave you open to harm." Clara felt her breath catch. His loyalty frightened her almost as much as the danger. His presence had become a shield around her home, but that shield made her a target. Her mind told her to push him away. Her heart told her the opposite. She didn't know which voice to follow anymore. Later that day, while Clara prepared supper, she saw Miriam and Tahoma outside near the corral. He was teaching her how to use a sling made from braided leather. Miriam giggled each time she missed her target, and Tahoma showed her patiently how to angle her wrist. Clara watched them, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and gratitude. Her daughter looked so happy, so confident, so safe. Clara realized how deeply she needed that safety too. But as the sun dipped low, the peace broke like thin glass. A distant shout echoed from the valley below, then another shout closer. Then the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Clara froze. Tahoma lifted Miriam into his arms and moved quickly toward the cabin. Clara met him at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "They are coming," he said quietly now. The riders appeared moments later, for settlers this time. Not 3. Their horses kicked up dust, and their rifles glinted in the orange light of sunset. Clara stood behind Tahoma, holding both children close. Her breath shook, but she did not step back. She would not hide behind walls. She would stand beside the one who had kept her children safe. One rider pointed toward the cabin. His face twisted with anger. "We warned you," he shouted. "We told you this wasn't right." Clara felt Miriam trembling against her. Tahoma stepped forward, calm but unmoving. "You have no place here," he said. His voice steady as stone. "We will not harm you." "But you leave now?" The settlers laughed. "You think we'll listen to you?" One yelled, "You think you can claim land here?" Clara stepped beside Tahoma, her shoulders shaking but her voice firm. "He is not claiming anything," she said. "He's keeping his child alive and helping mine," the rider sneered. "Then you're choosing him over your own people." Clara felt something snap inside her. "I'm choosing what's right," she said sharply. "And if you were decent men, you'd understand that." The rider shifted nervously as Tahoma moved slightly. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't even lift his hands. But something in his stance made them hesitate. A silent promise that if they tried to hurt the children, they would not leave untouched after a tense moment. The leader pulled his reins sharply. "Fine," he spat. "But this isn't over." The men turned their horses and rode off into the fading light. Leaving dust and anger behind them, Clara let out a shaky breath she had been holding for far too long. Tahoma placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "You did not hide," he said softly. "You stood strong." Clara looked at him, tears filling her eyes. "I wasn't strong," she whispered. "I was terrified." Tahoma shook his head gently. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said. "It is choosing to protect what your heart cannot lose." Clara felt those words settle deep inside her. She looked at Miriam, safe in Tahoma's arms. She looked at Nayeli, sleeping peacefully against her chest. And she realized something powerful. Protecting this fragile family, this bond born from struggle, was worth every risk. And from that moment forward, Clara knew she would choose her heart. Even if the world refused to understand it. The days after the confrontation passed slowly. But something had changed in Clara's heart. Fear still sat at the edges of her thoughts, but it no longer controlled her. Every morning she woke with renewed purpose. Holding Nayeli close and watching Miriam laugh as Tahoma taught her new things outside the cabin. The danger hadn't disappeared. But their bond had grown stronger, rooted in loyalty, trust, and love for the children who depended on them. Clara felt the shift in the air every time Tahoma approached the house. Not as a stranger, not as a visitor, but as someone whose presence brought safety, warmth, and balance. One cool morning, Clara stepped outside with Naeli across her chest. Wrapped securely in a soft blanket, Tahoma was already there, feeding Miriam pieces of warm cornbread he had traded from another family he trusted. Miriam giggled, crumbling the bread in her small fingers. Tahoma lifted her into his arms with practiced ease. Clara paused, watching them with a soft, quiet smile. The sight filled her with a gentle peace she hadn't felt since before her husband's death. She joined them, offering a small pouch of herbs she prepared the night before. "These will help Naeli breathe easier," she said. Handing the bag to Tahoma, he accepted it with gratitude, touching her wrist lightly in thanks. Clara didn't pull away. His touch was warm, grounding, and strangely comforting. She realized how much she now relied on his presence, not out of desperation, but because he had become part of the rhythm of her days, while the sun rose higher. Miriam took Tahoma's hand and dragged him toward the small grove behind the cabin. "Show Mama the secret path," she said proudly. Tahoma glanced at Clara for permission. She nodded, curiosity mixing with amusement. He led them through the grove, gently pushing aside branches until they reached a narrow trail hidden among the tall grass. "I show her this place to make her brave," Tahoma explained quietly. "To teach her the land is her friend, not her fear." Clara looked at her daughter, who stood tall with a bright grin. Her confidence had grown in ways Clara hadn't expected. Not because of Clara's teachings, but because of the man standing beside her. The trail opened into a meadow with soft wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Naeli stirred gently against Clara's chest. Miriam ran into the field. Spreading her arms as she spun in the golden light, Clara watched her, her heart filling with both joy and a bittersweet tenderness. Her daughter was no longer as fragile as before. She was blooming because she finally had someone guiding her, someone who filled the empty space left by loss. Tahoma stood beside Clara, his voice low and thoughtful. "My people watch," he said. "They know I come here." Clara stiffened. "Are they angry?" she asked, worried that danger might come from both sides. Tahoma shook his head slowly. "Some question," he admitted. "Some whisper, but most see what you do. They see you saved my child, and they honor that." Clara stared at him. Surprised, she had expected rejection from both the settlers and the tribe. She hadn't imagined acceptance could come from anywhere. "Your daughter grows strong because of you," Tahoma added, nodding toward Miriam. "And mine lives because of you." Clara felt tears rest behind her eyes, but didn't let them fall. Instead, she exhaled slowly, letting the weight of his gratitude settle deep inside her. When they returned to the cabin, the afternoon sky was tinted pink. Clara prepared supper while Tahoma tended the fire outside. Miriam played with a wooden horse Tahoma had carved for her. Naeli slept peacefully in her cradle, her small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The home felt full, alive. Warm, nothing like the lonely cabin Clara had lived in before. After supper, they gathered outside to watch the stars. Tahoma sat on the ground, Miriam curled in his lap, pointing excitedly at the constellations he described. Clara sat beside him, cradling Naeli, her shoulder brushing his occasionally. Neither moved away. The closeness felt natural. "Safe and unspoken, you have become part of our lives," Clara said quietly. "Not a question, not a confession, just truth." Tahoma looked at her with calm, steady eyes. "And you part of mine?" he replied. He glanced at the two children. "Both resting safely in their arms. They need us," he said. Together, Clara nodded slowly. She had spent so long denying the truth of what they had become. Not lovers, not husband and wife, by any tradition, but partners in survival, guardians of two little souls who relied on them. They were a family, an unexpected, unconventional, and fragile family. But a real one. The night air grew cooler, and Clara leaned slightly against Tahoma's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't question, just accepted the closeness with quiet strength. Above them, the stars shimmered like scattered embers. The world around them remained dangerous, full of judgment and misunderstanding. But in that small patch of land, under that shared sky, they had created something worth protecting. Clara looked down at Naeli, peaceful and safe. She looked at Miriam. who trusted Tahoma as if he were built from solid earth and strength. And she knew without a doubt that the bond they had formed was stronger than fear, stronger than whispers, stronger than the world that tried to divide them. A widow, a warrior, a fragile newborn, and a once lonely little girl somehow, they had become a family stitched together by courage, kindness, and choices made from the heart. And as the night deepened and the stars glowed brighter, Clara whispered a silent promise to the sky. She would protect this new family with everything she had, because love, in its quiet and unexpected form, had found them, and they would face the world together, under one sky,